On page 10 of your standard English booklet, you will find a bit about prescriptivists on the left-hand side and descriptivist approaches on the right-hand side. I want to talk about one of them that I think you might not have come across before, and this is the spat between Lynn Truss and Oliver Kamm. So on the right-hand side we have Oliver Kamm, who is a linguist, and on the left-hand side we have Lynn Truss, who's a writer of humorous style guides, and among them is one called Eats, Shoots and Leaves. So first of all, what is her beef? So she's writing about the misuse of apostrophes. Okay, for example, when used before the plural s, as you might see in a greengrocer's shop, hence it being called sometimes the grocer's or greengrocer's apostrophe. So they might write apples and then put an apostrophe between apple and the S of apples. So that's one thing that gets her goat. And the other thing is the use of the expression less for count nouns. Okay, before I go any further, just very quickly, a count noun is a noun that you can count. So apples, I can count apples, 1 apple, 2 apples, 3 apples. Yeah, but sand can't be counted in the same way. 1 sand, 2 sands. You'd have to say grain of sand, and then you're using the count noun grains. Okay, 2 grains of sand. So a count noun is one that can be counted, and a non-count noun is one that cannot be counted. Now, here's a common complaint among prescriptivists, that when they go into, say, Tesco, for example, they might say something like this. So Lynn Truss is just a good example of a pedantic approach towards language. She says, "We refuse to patronize any shop with checkouts for, quote, 8 items or less. It should be fewer." So what point exactly is being made here? So just to clarify and link it to what we just said about count nouns, not countdown, that's very different. So because 8 items, right? Because items are a count noun, so just do a little link here to count noun. Because items are a count noun, yeah, it should be fewer, not less. Okay, so basically we don't like, in the prescriptivist camp, we don't like less for count nouns. Okay, so have a think now for a count noun. So think about something like people, and think about whether, if you were saying more people, would you say there are less people there or there are fewer people there? What sounds more natural to you? And then what sounds more correct? Okay, and it depends what you mean by natural and correct, doesn't it, in those different circumstances. So people like Lynn Truss believe that there is a right and a wrong here, and that it should always be fewer and not less in that case. Okay, so that's the fewer less distinction kind of covered. So basically, in short, fewer should be used for count nouns. Okay, but what about the other end of the spectrum here? So if we go over to prescriptivists like Oliver Kamm, who's written books which explode some of the most, well, to him, frustrating non-rules that prescriptivists put about. Before we read what he says, I just want to get a little bit of background to what he's talking about. So Oliver Kamm is critical of what, now I'm trying to write with my mouse, so this is going to look comically bad, but he's critical of what he calls non-rules by prescriptivists. Rules that are basically things they don't like, but are not rules of grammar. This is a really good example of one of these non-rules. So he says in his book, no genuine rule, interesting adjective there, dictates the use of less or fewer. And he gives an example. I think this is quite a convincing example. He says, fewer than 10 miles sounds ridiculous. No one would say that in their right mind. And he adds something else. It is the mark of the pedant to imagine that there is only one answer. So in other words, you're just not seeing things with the full perspective of the way people talk. You're just saying that there is a right and a wrong, and that's the end to it. But actually, he says there is no grammatical rule. You won't find it in the rules of the language. In fact, he has a more radical approach. He says that to find out what the rules of the language are, you look at the language. So you look at the way people use language. So I would just say about what he said there, that he would say that we need to be guided by, and this is where my childlike handwriting comes up again, we need to be guided by the usage of words and how they're actually used in the real world. Okay, so we should be guided by the way people really use words. And he says people don't say fewer than 10 miles because you would sound insane. Now, I'm going to say here there probably are a handful of people who would say fewer than 10 miles, but we're picturing people like, exactly, the people like Truss and people like, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who issued a style guide to members of his staff. If you don't know who Jacob Rees-Mogg is, just by the name, Google it and have a look for me. Okay, so that is the punctuation and the fewer less distinction. And now you can say you know about a prescriptivist approach to that, and then what a descriptivist like Kamm would respond. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.